This is the Austin Constitution Meetup of October 15th, 2013. I'm John Roland. This topic this evening, first topic, is government shutdown and the debt ceiling. What I have on the screen is a blog posting at constitutionalism.blogspot.com, which you can refer to if you have trouble reading it in the video. And as time proceeds, I'm adding material to this posting, so if you come back and visit, you may find there have been more things added to it. I wrote it as a fact, frequently asked questions, since this is a fast-breaking subject, and a blog posting provides a convenient way to cover the subject because it's easy to add stuff to it. Let's move on to a few of the first question and its answer. If there's no congressional appropriation, how can the government keep spending money on, quote, essential, unquote, operations? And the answer is constitutionally it can. There's no constitutional exception for essential operations. If government complied with the Constitution, it would have to shut down all spending and proceed entirely using unpaid volunteers, as it did at the beginning. The reason why government continues to operate and to spend money for what it calls essential operations is there is a statute that allows for that. However, the statute doesn't really say that it can spend money to do that, only that it can continue the operations, and and it's just understood that means spending money. But in reality, all it can really do is call for volunteers to do things and not pay them. And although they might get paid eventually, if and when the appropriation is passed by Congress, they might never get paid. And the recent bill that did get passed by Congress, retroactively paying people for services they might perform during this current shutdown, so-called shutdown, is really a mistake, because everyone involved needs to understand that they may never get paid. And it creates a bad situation in that if people expect to get paid eventually, they may do things inappropriately. And there's also a statute which forbids people to work for nothing. Apparently it's not being applied or enforced for a lot of people. And the theory was that this was a 19th century statute, that if people could continue to work voluntarily, they would later have a claim on the government for back wages. And the Congress at the time didn't want them to be able to claim back wages or to use government resources. So they have all kinds of conflicts here, which they're mostly trying to ignore. But what it does do, from the viewpoint of all factions in this dispute, first of all, it allows the president, the administration, to lay off people in a way that will put the most pressure on the opposition. On the other hand, from the other party faction's point of view, it is laying the burden on the president of deciding who to lay off. And therefore, he takes the heat for that. So each side is essentially shifting, trying to shift the heat to the other side, putting the decision of who to lay off and who not to lay off on the administration. Okay, next question. How can some spending be outside the appropriation process? And constitutionally it can. It is done on the rationalization that the Constitution does not explicitly forbid setting up independent agencies that may be self-funded from their own taxes or fees, or forbid multi-year appropriations for other than the Army. But the Constitution doesn't authorize those things either. And one cannot logically infer a power from the omission of a prohibition on its exercise. The design established by the Constitution requires all revenues go into the Treasury and all disbursements to be made under appropriations that may not extend beyond the terms of Congress, which are 2-year periods. Next, why can't government workers volunteer? Constitutionally, there is no authority to stop them from doing so, although there is a 19th century criminal statute that forbids it. The statute could constitutionally forbid volunteers to use government-owned assets, but the only authority to forbid voluntary action would be to fire them. And of course, they're not being paid anyway. And they could then volunteer as non-employees using their own resources. Of course, if government prosecutors are furloughed, there would be no one to enforce the statute. Somehow, one suspects this is something of a dead letter. So who's to blame for the shutdown? The Constitution requires agreement by both houses of Congress and the President to authorize spending from one year to the next, and not to authorize permanent appropriation for anything. So the default is to not spend, and the default belongs to those who insist on spending over the objections of one of the other components, in this case the House of Representatives, which has superior authority as the only house that may initiate spending bills. The compromise position would be to cut all spending not agreed to by all the components, which means that if what the House agrees to does not include Obamacare, and then the compromise would be for the Senate to also not include Obamacare, or whatever program or department it might be. There is, contrary to some discussants in this field, no obligation of the government to spend money on anything. It can literally not spend money on anything. Now, of course, if it didn't spend money on defense, we'd get invaded and conquered. If it doesn't spend money on courts, we'd be left with, a tooth and nail fighting one another for our rights. So there will be all kinds of undesirable consequences of not spending money on certain kinds of essential functions. But one can speak of moral obligations, but moral obligations are not legal obligations. And there is actually nothing in the Constitution that requires the government to spend money on anything, including the payment of debts. Now, it has sometimes been argued incompetently that Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, stating that the federal debt may not be questioned, is somehow a mandate to pay all federal debts. That's not true. It's a requirement that they not be repudiated, but if there's no money, they can't be paid, and you can't constitutionally create money out of thin air. This practice of printing money out of thin air to pay debts is unconstitutional, even though it's becoming an accepted practice. Why would the government default if the debt ceiling is not raised? Well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by default. The way most economists use the term, it would only be failure to pay interest on lawful bond debt and principal on such debt when it comes due. And there's more than enough revenue from taxes to pay those things. So from that viewpoint, there is no risk of default if the debt ceiling is not raised. However, the way the administration and supporters in Congress are using the term, it is any and all obligations or expectations of payment, from payment of medical claims on Medicare to vendors of goods and services to subsidies and grants to key constituents. That is a matter of not wanting to incur the political costs of ending patronage. It is sometimes argued, well, that we paid into Social Security, therefore we are entitled to receive benefits. Well, that's not true. There's a Supreme Court case, Fleming v. Nestor, which considered that and proclaimed very clearly, coldly, and correctly that no one who pays into Social Security has any property right in any amount of money. It can be cut off at any time, and there's no one has any standing to sue to get money. What would happen if the debt ceiling were not raised? The government would have to immediately stop all spending in excess of revenues, which would be a reduction of about 30%. That would mean ending almost all entitlement spending on things like Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, food stamps, housing subsidies, education subsidies, and payments to government-funded pension funds. Arguably, Social Security benefits could continue as long enough as enough FICA taxes were collected. But since those taxes are not keeping up with benefits, those benefits would have to be reduced and continue to fall. Advocates of more spending and borrowing make the Keynesian argument that a sudden cutoff would be disastrous to the economy. There would almost certainly be a shock from any sudden change in government spending, and many enterprises that have grown to depend on it might go bankrupt. But reduced government's borrowing would also make more investment funds available to other things, like expanding businesses, creating jobs, and investing in new technologies. So after a period of adjustment, the net effect is likely to be beneficial to the economy. And I might add on that point that the government has had large layoffs of people in the past. After the First and Second World Wars, there was a demobilization of service personnel. After World War II, we went from 12 million employed service personnel to about 1.566 million. That's more than 10 million people suddenly laid off and thrown on the economy. And we managed to get through that. Now, of course, part of what was going on there is that a lot of the jobs that the guys would have done before the war were being done by women, their wives and sisters and mothers and so forth. And after they were demobilized, the women left those jobs and turned them over to men, but not completely. There was a period during which absorbing that many people into the economy was a challenge, but we managed to do it. I vaguely remember that period. I was just a little kid at the time, but it was a subject of some discussion, and basically everybody pulled together to create jobs for all the returning servicemen. So that plus the GI Bill, which enabled a lot of them to go to college and acquire degrees, greatly worked fairly well to deal with the situation. So yeah, if we had to lay off 30% of all federal government employees, we could do it. It would be rough, be a lot of foreclosures maybe, a lot of bankruptcies. It wouldn't be easy, but we could do it. Next, has this country ever defaulted? A lot of people are saying, well, the country has never defaulted. Well, that's not true. There have actually been at least 3, and arguably 4 defaults in our history. The first one was following the War of Independence. Technically, the deferral probably can be said to have occurred during the war, before the Constitution was ratified, but it came to a head in 1790, after the Constitution was ratified, when Congress had assumed the debt of all the states for the war, and it had already been issuing continentals, which are paper money. Both the central government and the state governments were issuing continentals. But then we got the expression, not worth a continental. And what happened there is nobody could buy anything with them. So what a lot of people who had received a lot of continental dollars were doing, were selling them to speculators, often typically for pennies on the dollar. And those speculators later were able to convert a lot of those continentals, not to gold, there wasn't enough gold, but to land in the Northwest Territory, the Ohio Valley, and what is now the states of Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and so forth. And they proceeded to develop the land, sell it to settlers, and recover their investment that way. The speculators made out all right, most of them. The original recipients of it did not, for the most part. And so that is technically a default. But you notice that it was the response to the default was to issue paper money. Well, that happened again during the Civil War. During the Civil War, as early as 1862, the Union found it did not have enough gold to pay for the war. So it passed the Legal Tender Act in 1862, in which it would pay its debts in what became known as greenbacks, which vaguely resemble the paper money we still use today. After the war, people were expecting the greenbacks to eventually be redeemed in gold. But the federal government, the Union government, didn't have gold to redeem them. So people started suing the Union government, now the national government, to redeem those greenbacks in gold. And the government had the Legal Tender Act, which in effect allowed it to use paper money, and which was not backed by gold. So it won the suit. Now, there was more than one case, the legal tender cases. In the first of the legal tender cases, the government lost. The Legal Tender Act was deemed to be unconstitutional, correctly. But under pressure from the Republican faction in Congress, were not the Republicans of today, they were the ones who were the dominant party during the Civil War. The Supreme Court caved, and in subsequent legal tender cases, it sided with the government and allowed it to issue paper money backed by nothing in payment for its debts, and further to require that anyone that had such paper money could use it to pay their debts and so forth. So that was the beginning of paper money as we know it today. Now, by 1933, the paper money not backed by any gold or silver was not accepted in payment for anything. The government was issuing silver and gold certificates, which could be redeemed for silver or gold. And there you might still occasionally find a silver certificate in circulation. But in 1933, the government didn't have enough gold to redeem all of the gold certificates it had outstanding. So it passed the Banking Act of 1933, calling for all those gold certificates to be turned in together with all gold. And so it seized all gold in private hands, except, of course, for a few banks and other special favored parties. Of course, a lot of people went and buried their gold and silver in the ground. My own grandparents were among those, but they didn't have much to bury, so it didn't make much difference for them. But that was a default. Again, the default took the form, was met by issuing paper money instead of gold and silver. So people were getting paid, but not with what they expected to get paid in. Now, that was acceptable or deemed acceptable or sold, to the people as something that they could accept on the theory that the government would not create more paper money at a faster rate than the growth of the economy. Gold and silver were somewhat deflationary because the supply of them was not growing as fast as the economy was growing, even during the Depression. So, or at least years leading up to the Depression. So, by issuing money as the economy grew at a moderate pace, they created a currency that people could accept with the expectation that it wouldn't become worthless by having too much of it printed. Well, that hasn't worked out too well. There was one more default, or arguable default, in 1971, when Richard Nixon abrogated U.S. commitment to the Bretton Woods Accords, which was kind of international treaty among the 42 leading nations to back their national currencies in gold for international transactions. The United States was then not able to meet that obligation, so it simply abrogated its commitment to it. Well, that had the practical effect of sinking the entire Bretton Woods Accords for all the nations involved. And they all went off the gold standard. So, again, that was a default, and it was, the response to it was to replace the kind of money that people were expecting to be paid in with what amounts to worthless paper money. Now, recently, we have seen what could be considered another kind of default, the issuance of unlimited amounts, or not unlimited, but very large amounts of currency through the 3 rounds of so-called quantitative easing. Now, by historical standards, one would think that would generate a round of hyperinflation. The reason why it hasn't, at least not yet, is because that currency is going into the financial sector. It's not going into the commodities market. And what I like to liken it to, imagine a mouse with a tick on its back. The tick is sucking blood out of the mouse. As it sucks blood out of the mouse, it swells, gets bigger and bigger. The mouse is our commodities economy. The tick is the financial sector. Now, the financial sector is supposed to feed money back into the economy to help it grow. But when it gets involved in a speculative fervor, it grows within itself without regard to any contribution it might make to the growth of the commodities sector. Well, when it gets to the point where it is facing collapse and you pump more blood into it, it continues to swell and swell and swell until the mouse can't even move. At some point, the tick is going to burst. But it doesn't burst like a tick in real life would burst, spreading blood all over the mouse cage. It bursts through its mouth and feeds all that blood into the mouse. So when the financial sector does finally collapse, and it has to, the way we're feeding speculation in it, then when it does, suddenly everybody's going to be abandoning stocks and bonds and turning to commodities. And then you're going to see hyperinflation. And it could happen almost overnight. So, I propose some remedies for this. Now, there are several things that could be done in the short term. I was involved in a teleforum, Federalist Society teleforum, a couple of days ago. Yesterday, in which Senator Mike Lee, one of the leaders of the Tea Party faction in the Senate, was arguing for his balanced budget amendment, which is frankly a very bad idea. It would never work. But it's also not a solution to the current problem. What I proposed for just right now is for the Senate to offer a budget, an appropriation, which budgets debt as well as spending. In other words, department by department. What we have now is a kind of moral hazard. Departments are limited as to how much they can spend, but not how much debt they can generate. So, for example, a Department of Government may only have an appropriation to spend $5,000 on office furniture, but it can place an order for a $10,000 hand-carved teakwood desk. And if it accepts delivery on it, it has arguably created a debt on the authority of the department head or whoever is the purchasing officer of that department. Now you may say, well, okay, but they don't have the authority to spend the $10,000. No, they don't, but they have created a debt, which then becomes due from the general treasury, not just from the budget of that department. This lack of control over the generating or creating debt is a key flaw in the budgetary process. Simply having a single debt ceiling for the entire government doesn't do it. It needs to be brought down to the department and the program level. And so what I propose is that Congress, and this could be done by a few members of it, could simply, in their every appropriation bill, appropriate debt at the same time that they appropriate spending. So every department, if it gets allocated, say, $1 billion, it gets allocated maybe $100,000 in debt authority, but no more. So that would bring a lot of control over the monetary and fiscal discipline, or lack thereof, that's now infests government. That could be done right away. But I do have some amendments, 3 of them actually. The first one, it clarifies the concept of appropriation, that no expenditure shall be made or obligation incurred or committed by or for the government or any activity under supervision except within appropriations enacted by Congress, which shall specify the amount and the department or activity it may support and which shall not exceed 6 years. In other words, there are a few things where you might want to have 6-year appropriations, but they would also have to have 6-year debt ceilings on a department-by-department basis. And that would include all of the departments like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, everything that's now off budget. It would no longer be possible under this amendment for people to write themselves an obligation just by applying for benefits, as they can now. Right now, there's no limit on how many people may apply. So, if you have a system where unlimited numbers of people can apply for benefits, you have a problem. So if you have a ceiling on that, you would have to have a ceiling on how many could apply and be accepted in any given year, fiscal year. And if they exceeded that limit, they'd be stuck until the next year, and so forth. So that would take care of that problem. Now, clarification of Article 1, Section 7. This is the section where it says that all bills, but it doesn't specify, or at least doesn't make clear to modern readers, that bills shall include proposals within bills. And any proposal for raising or receiving revenues or dispersing funds, including for borrowing or lending, shall originate in the House of Representatives and shall specify rates, amounts, objects, and purposes. In other words, the House would have to spell it all out, both not only spending, but also borrowing, and give the exact amounts, the exact rates, what it's to be used for, and what purpose it's to serve. 3, challenges the debt. This gets to essentially clarifies Section 4 of the 14th Amendment, which says that no debt of the federal government shall be questioned. As I said earlier, that only means it may not be repudiated. That doesn't mean that if there's no money to pay it, that it has to be paid anyway. This provides a remedial procedure for spending or debt that lacks authority. So it says, no debt by the United States or any department thereof shall be incurred or held valid that funds consumption by other than military personnel and militia personnel in federal service, or funds payment of principal or interest on existing debt. And any person may challenge the validity of any debt, whereupon the government shall have 20 days to prove it is authorized by law and not for consumption except as provided above, failing which the debt shall be deemed null and void. In other words, if Congress didn't enforce its own laws, if the executive branch didn't enforce its own laws, if the courts didn't enforce it, then nevertheless, any individual can come in and challenge it. This would essentially be a writ of quo warranto. And if the government didn't prove it had authority as provided herein, the debt would be null and void. So with the expectation that their debts might become declared null and void, it would behoove vendors not to sell things to the government on credit without checking to make sure that it had authority to make such a purchase on credit. So that covers this essential point. And I guess we can leave it at that for the present video.